man can spend a lifetime convincing himself that the rumble of a passing train is the only company he needs. He can learn the language of steel on steel, the lonesome cry of the whistle in the dead of night, and believe it is enough. But the world has other sounds, quieter and far more damning. Sounds that can find a man even in the isolation he has built for himself. For one railroad worker, the sound wasn't a train, but the whimpering of a 17-year-old blind girl, left tied to a fence by the father who was supposed to be her entire world. It was a sound that would either shatter his solitude or redefine it forever. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The dust of the rail yard was a permanent resident in Silas's lungs, a gritty testament to a life spent beside the endless, parallel lines of escape. Each morning he walked the track, his hammer and wrench heavy in his calloused hands, his gaze fixed on the ties and the gravel. He checked for fractures, for weaknesses, for the slightest imperfection that could derail a journey. It was a task of meticulous, lonely precision, a ritual that kept the ghosts of his own fractured past at bay. The world beyond the tracks was a blur, a series of indistinct shapes and muted colors he chose not to focus on. His small, clapboard house stood just 50 yards from the rails, trembling with the passage of every freight train, a constant reminder of his self-imposed exile. The fence line where the railroad's property met the unkempt wilderness was his boundary, the edge of his universe. But on this day, a sound snagged in the air, thin and sharp, almost lost beneath the drone of cicadas. It was not the familiar cry of a hawk or the rustle of a stray dog. It was human. A knot of ice formed in Silas's gut. Human sounds were complications, threads that could unravel the tightly wound spool of his solitude. He tried to ignore it, to dismiss it as the wind playing tricks on the wire fence, but it came again, a choked sob that spoke of a pain so profound it cut through his carefully constructed apathy. He hesitated, his boots feeling heavy as anchors. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to retreat into the safety of his routine, to let the world handle its own brutal affairs. But his feet, guided by a forgotten echo of decency, moved him forward, toward the fence, toward the source of that terrible, desolate sound. He found her there, a slight figure folded into herself against a rust-pocked fence post. Her wrists were bound to the wire with a length of coarse rope, the knots pulled cruelly tight, chafing her dark skin raw. She was young, barely a woman, her clothes torn and grimy. A dirty strip of cloth was tied over her eyes, but it was the vacant, unseeing way her head was angled toward the sound of his approach that told him the truth. She was blind. For a long moment, Silas simply stood there, the silence stretching between them, thick with the heat and the girl's ragged breathing. The train tracks behind him seemed to mock him, two gleaming lines promising an escape he suddenly felt unworthy of. He saw the faint, dark bruises on her arms, the tremor in her hunched shoulders. This was not an accident. This was an act of disposal, as casual and callous as leaving trash by the side of the road. He took a slow step forward, the gravel crunching under his boot. The girl flinched violently, pulling against the ropes, a small, terrified sound catching in her throat. "Easy now," Silas said, his voice a low rasp, rough from disuse. It was the first time he'd spoken to another soul in days, and the words felt foreign, clumsy. He knelt, his old knees protesting, and reached for the knots. His fingers, so adept at handling cold, hard steel, fumbled with the rough fibers of the rope. He could smell the stale scent of cheap whiskey on it, and a wave of cold fury washed over him. He worked with a grim, focused intensity, his breath held tight in his chest. The knots finally gave way, and her hands fell limply to her sides. She didn't move. She just sat there, trembling, a statue of fear. Silas rose, backing away to give her space, the frayed piece of rope dangling from his hand like a dead snake. He looked from her small, still form to the vast, empty landscape surrounding them. There was no one to see, no one to help, no one to blame but the ghost who had left her here. He was alone with this broken child, and the weight of that reality settled on him, heavier than any locomotive. He led her back to his house, his hand hovering near her elbow, not quite daring to touch. She followed the sound of his footsteps, her own steps tentative, shuffling through the dust. The house was an extension of Silas himself, stark, silent, and filled with the ghosts of things left unsaid. He settled her into a wooden chair at the small kitchen table, the only piece of furniture not coated in a thin layer of rail yard grit. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the hum of the old refrigerator and the girl's shallow breaths. He didn't know what to do. He was a man who mended iron, not people. He moved awkwardly around the small space, opening and closing cupboards, the sounds unnaturally loud. He poured a glass of water, his hand shaking slightly, and placed it on the table in front of her. "Here," he muttered. Her hands remained in her lap. She gave no sign she had heard him. He nudged the glass closer until it touched her fingertips. She flinched, but then slowly, her fingers traced the cool surface of the glass, exploring its shape before wrapping around it. She drank, her throat working, the simple act seeming to take a monumental effort. Silas watched her, a tightness in his chest he hadn't felt in years. He saw the exhaustion etched into the lines of her young face, the way her shoulders were permanently hunched, as if waiting for a blow that never came. He was a stranger. His house was a strange place, and yet she was here. The weight of it was immense. He was responsible. The thought was a terrifying intrusion into his ordered world. Later, as dusk painted the sky in shades of bruised purple, he made her a plate of bread and cheese, a meal as simple and bleak as his own existence. She ate slowly, methodically, without a word. When she was done, he didn't know where she should sleep. His own bed was a narrow cot, in a room that held nothing but a small dresser, and a lifetime of regret. The only other room was a spare room, but the door had been closed for a decade, the air inside stale with memory and loss. It was a tomb, and he was its keeper. He couldn't put her in there, so he took the thin blanket from his own bed and laid it on the worn floorboards of the main room, a safe distance from himself. "You can sleep here," he said to the quiet room. She seemed to understand, curling up on the blanket, pulling her knees to her chest, a small, solitary island in the vast emptiness of his home. Days bled into one another, marked only by the thunder of passing trains. The girl, who he learned was named Alara, remained a silent presence in his house. She moved with a cautious grace, her hands, her eyes, mapping the geography of his small world. The 4 chairs, the sturdy table, the door frame that led to the porch. Silas found himself adjusting his life in small, unconscious ways. He stopped leaving his tools on the floor. He moved a chair that was in her path. He started describing things out loud, a running commentary on the mundane. "Sun's coming up over the East Ridge," he'd say, his voice startling himself. "Train at noon will be the westbound freight, Carrie's lumber." Alara never responded, but he felt she was listening, her head tilted slightly, absorbing the sounds of his world. One afternoon, as he sat on the porch mending a leather glove, a sound made him look up. It was Alara humming. The tune was fragile, a simple, meandering melody, but it was the first voluntary sound she had made beyond breathing. It was a crack in the wall of silence she had built around herself. He remained perfectly still, not wanting to scare it away. The humming was like a tiny, resilient weed pushing its way through cracked concrete. Later that evening, a sudden storm rolled in, the thunder cracking directly overhead. A particularly loud clap shook the house, and Alara cried out, a sharp, terrified sound. Silas was by her side in an instant. She was rigid, her hands clamped over her ears. "It's just thunder," he said, his voice low and steady. "Just the sky making noise. It can't hurt you." A shudder racked her body. He used to yell like that," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The words hung in the air, heavy and jagged. It was the first piece of her story, a shard of a shattered past. Silas didn't ask for more. He just sat on the floor near her, a silent, unmoving presence until the storm passed and her trembling subsided. He was beginning to understand that caring for her wasn't about doing, but about being present, being still. His own locked room, the one at the end of the hall, seemed to loom in his mind. He hadn't opened that door in 10 years. He wondered, with a jolt of fear and something akin to hope, if he ever would again. The fragile peace of their shared solitude could not last. Silas knew this. The world had a way of sniffing out secrets, of peering into windows meant to be shuttered. His supply of flour and beans was running low, and the trip to town was an unavoidable necessity. He left Alara sitting on the porch, her face turned toward the sun she could feel but not see, and walked the 2 miles to the dusty collection of buildings that passed for a town. The air in the general store was thick with the smell of sawdust and suspicion. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, eyed the extra bag of flour Silas placed on the counter. "Stocking up for a long winter, Silas?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Just tired of making the trip," Silas grunted, avoiding his gaze. He could feel the weight of Henderson's curiosity, a palpable thing. As he left, he saw Mrs. Gable, his nearest neighbor whose house was a 1/4 mile down the dirt road, sweeping her porch. She watched him with the predatory stillness of a hawk, her eyes narrowing as she took in his larger-than-usual purchase. He gave a curt nod and kept walking, the back of his neck prickling. Rumors in a town this small traveled faster than the express train. They were whispers that could become a mob, a force of righteous certainty that could tear down a man's life for the crime of being different. He hurried back, an unfamiliar anxiety churning in his stomach. He wasn't just protecting his own isolation anymore. He was protecting her. He was shielding this fragile, humming girl from the harsh glare of a world that would not understand. A world that would see her as a burden, a problem to be solved by forms and institutions. A few days later, the world arrived in the form of a dust-covered patrol car. Sheriff Brody stepped out, a big man whose uniform seemed too tight, his face set in a permanent expression of weary authority. He ambled up to the porch where Silas was cleaning a lantern. "Silas," Brody said, his voice deceptively friendly. "Heard some talk in town. Folks saying you've got company." Silas didn't stop his work, his hands moving with deliberate slowness. "Folks talk too much. They say it's a girl," the sheriff pressed on, his gaze sweeping over the silent house. "A young one." Silas finally looked up, his eyes cold as steel rails in winter. "This is my property, Sheriff. What happens on it is my business." Brody's friendly demeanor hardened. "Not when it involves a child, it isn't. Is there a girl here, Silas? I need a straight answer." The choice was laid bare before him, stark and unavoidable. He could lie and risk the sheriff coming back with a warrant, or he could tell some version of the truth and lose her to the cold, impersonal machinery of the state. He thought of Alara inside, humming her quiet tune, a sound of life in the tomb of his house. The law was just a word. Her safety was real. The lie came easier than he expected. "My cousin's girl," Silas said, his voice flat and even. "Her mother's sick. She's staying with me for a bit." Sheriff Brody's eyes narrowed, searching Silas's face for a crack. "What's her name?" The question was a test, a baited hook. Silas's mind went blank for a terrifying second. Then he remembered the name she had whispered during the storm. Alara. The sheriff chewed on the name and the lie for a long moment. "Funny, no one in your family ever mentioned a cousin with a daughter, especially not one who'd send her to, well, here." The unspoken insult hung in the air. Brody's gaze drifted to the closed curtains of the front window. "I'd like to see her, Silas, just to make sure everything's on the level." A cold dread washed over Silas. "She's sleeping. Then wake her up." The demand was quiet, but it was not a request. Silas's hands tightened on the lantern he was holding. He could feel the confrontation escalating, the fragile bubble of his sanctuary about to burst. He was a man who had spent a decade avoiding conflict, and now it stood on his porch wearing a badge. Just then, a sound drifted from inside the house. It was Alara's humming, the same fragile melody as before. It was a sound of innocence, of peace, and in that moment it sounded like an accusation. Brody's head tilted. That her. Before Silas could answer, the screen door creaked open. Alara stood there, her hand on the door frame, her face pale. The strip of cloth was gone from her eyes, revealing milky, sightless orbs that seemed to look right through the sheriff. "Silas?" she asked, her voice small. "Is someone here?" The sheriff stared at her, his suspicion warring with a flicker of something else. Pity, perhaps, or discomfort. He saw the blind eyes, the vulnerability. His official posture sagged slightly. "Everything all right here, miss?" he asked, his voice softer now. Alara turned her head toward the sound of his voice. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. "Silas is taking care of me." The simple, honest words were more powerful than any lie Silas could have concocted. They seemed to drain the tension from the air, Brody looked from the blind girl to the grim, silent man beside him. This wasn't the sordid situation his mind, fed by town gossip, had imagined. It was just sad. He let out a slow breath. "All right, Silas. But if I hear any more talk, I'll be back, and I'll bring the state welfare people with me." He tipped his hat to Alara and walked back to his car, leaving a cloud of dust and the echo of his threat behind. In the days that followed the sheriff's visit, the silence in the house changed. It was no longer a void, but a space filled with unspoken questions. Alara began to talk more, not in long conversations, but in fragments, like puzzle pieces of a life he could barely imagine. She would be tracing the wood grain of the table and murmur, "He didn't like noise." Or she would be sitting on the porch listening to the birds and say, "Mama used to sing this song." The past was not a distant country for her. It was a room she still lived in. Silas found himself piecing together the horror. The father, a man made of drunken rage and self-pity. The mother, a ghost of a memory gone long ago. He pictured a small girl navigating a world of darkness, her only guide a man who was a storm of unpredictable violence. He imagined her learning to be quiet, to be invisible, to live in the spaces between the yelling. One evening, as Silas was banking the fire in the wood stove, the smell of the smoke triggered something in her. She went still, her hands clenching in her lap. "The fire," she whispered. He threw my doll in the fire." Silas stopped, the poker hot in his hand. He didn't turn around. He just listened. "It was Mama's," she continued, her voice trembling. "She made it for me. It had button eyes and yarn hair. I told him it was all I had left of her. He said memories were just dead weight." The words struck Silas with the force of a physical blow. Dead weight. He knew that phrase. He had used it on himself for years, a justification for his own flight from the past. He had told himself that his grief over his wife and son was a burden to be discarded, an anchor holding him down. He had cut the ropes to his own memories, believing it was a form of strength, of survival. But hearing it from the mouth of a cruel man, used as a weapon against a child, he saw the lie for what it was. It wasn't strength. It was cowardice. He turned and looked at Alara, this child who had been told her most precious connections were worthless. And yet, she remembered the doll. She remembered the song. She had carried her memories through the darkness, not as dead weight, but as the only proof she had ever been loved at all. That night, Silas couldn't sleep. The house felt smaller, the walls closing in. Ilara's words about the doll, about memories being dead weight, had unlocked something in him. A door he had nailed shut and tried to forget existed. He found himself standing before the other closed door in his house, the one at the end of the hall. His hand hovered over the dusty knob, trembling. For 10 years, this room had been a monument to his failure, a place he could not bear to enter. With a deep, shuddering breath, he turned the knob. The door swung open with a groan of protest, releasing a wave of stale, still air. The moonlight filtered through a grimy window pane, illuminated the shapes within. A small wooden rocking horse, covered in a white sheet like a tiny ghost. A child's bed, the blanket still rumpled. On the bedside table sat a framed photograph, face down. His hand, clumsy with a decade of unshed grief, reached out and turned it over. It was his wife, Maria, her smile radiant, her arms wrapped around their son, Daniel, a boy of 6 with Silas's dark hair and his mother's bright, laughing eyes. The image was a punch to the gut. He remembered the day it was taken. A picnic by the river, the sun warm on their faces. Daniel had been chasing a frog, his laughter echoing in the trees. 2 weeks later, the fever came. It was swift and merciless. The doctor had shaken his head, his face grim. There was nothing to be done. Silas had railed against it, against the doctor, against God, against the sheer random cruelty of it all. After the funeral, Maria had simply faded. She moved through the house like a shadow, her smiles gone, her laughter silenced. The light in her eyes had been extinguished. 6 months later, she walked to the train tracks in the middle of the night and waited. He had found her the next morning. It was then that he had packed up his life, taken the job with the railroad, the very instrument of his pain, and fled. He had run to a place where the only sounds were mechanical. The only grief was the lonely cry of a whistle. He had convinced himself he was escaping the pain, but he had only been carrying it, a silent, heavy passenger. He looked at the photograph, at the smiling faces of the family he had failed to protect, and, for the first time in 10 years, Silas wept. He wept for the boy who never grew up, for the woman who lost her light, and for the man who had turned himself into a ghost. He finally understood. He hadn't been protecting Alara from the world. He had been protecting himself from the pain of caring again. The knock on the door came 2 weeks later, harder and more insistent this time. Silas knew before he opened it. Sheriff Brody stood on the porch, but he wasn't alone. A stern-faced woman in a drab brown suit stood beside him, a leather portfolio clutched in her hand like a weapon. She was the state. "Silas," Brody said, his voice stripped of any pretense of friendliness. "This is Ms. Albright from the Department of Child Services. We know the girl isn't your cousin." Silas's heart hammered against his ribs. He stepped partly outside, trying to block the doorway, to shield the fragile peace within from the coming storm. "She's fine here," he said, his voice a low growl. Ms. Albright stepped forward, her eyes cold and assessing. "Mr. Silas, we have a report that an underage girl, an unregistered blind minor, is living here without a legal guardian. The law is very clear. She needs to be in proper care. A state facility equipped to handle her condition." The word condition dripped with a clinical disdain that made Silas's blood run cold. They saw her as a file, a case number, a problem to be managed. They couldn't see the girl who hummed quiet tunes, who could identify a bird by its song, who was slowly, tentatively learning to trust again. "This is her home," Silas stated, his feet planted firmly. "She's safe here." "Safe?" Ms. Albright scoffed, gesturing at the peeling paint and the looming shadow of the rail yard. "This is no place for a child, especially one with her disadvantages. She needs professional help, structure. We're here to take her to a place where she can get that." Brody looked uncomfortable, but resolute. "We have a court order, Silas. Don't make this difficult." Just then, Alara appeared in the doorway behind him. She had heard the raised voices, the hard edge of authority. Her face was a mask of fear, the same fear he'd seen when he first found her tied to that fence. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ms. Albright's gaze softened for a fraction of a second before hardening again into professional resolve. "It's all right, dear," she said in a tone one might use for a frightened animal. "We're going to take you to a new place, a better place." Alara shrank back, her hand finding Silas's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "No," she said, her voice small but clear. "I want to stay." This was the moment. The culmination of all the fear, all the grief, all the fragile hope that had taken root in this desolate place. It was no longer just his fight. Silas looked down at Alara's hand gripping his arm, then back at the unyielding faces of the law and the state. He felt a lifetime of running coming to an end right here, on this dilapidated porch. He had run from his grief, from his failure, from the memory of his wife and son. But he would not run from this. He straightened up, his shoulders squaring, no longer a man trying to hide, but a man making a stand. "You are not taking her," he said, his voice resonating with a certainty that startled even himself. Ms. Albright opened her mouth to protest, to cite regulations and protocols, but Silas spoke over her. "You talk about a proper place. You talk about her condition. Do you know her name? Do you know what song she hums when she thinks no one is listening? Do you know that she's afraid of thunder because it sounds like the man who left her to die?" His words were quiet, but they landed like hammer blows. The sheriff and the social worker were silent. "You see a problem to be filed away in a concrete building," Silas continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I see a girl who survived. A girl who deserves more than a number and a cot in a room full of strangers. You think your facility is better than this? This house is quiet. This house is safe. Here, she is not a condition. She is Alara." He looked directly at Brody, man to man. "You know what kind of man her father was. You can smell it on the rope he used. Is that the system you're so eager to return her to? A system that let her fall through the cracks until she ended up tied to a fence?" Brody had the decency to look away, a flicker of shame in his eyes. It was Alara who delivered the final devastating blow. She let go of Silas's arm and took a hesitant step forward, her sightless eyes fixed in the direction of Ms. Albright's voice. "He found me," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "No one else was looking, but he found me. I'm staying with him." The simple declaration, filled with a trust she had given to no one else, hung in the air. There was no protocol for this, no form to fill out for a child who chose a broken man in a broken house over the sterile promise of the state. Miss Albright looked at Brody, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He knew a losing battle when he saw one. Defeated by a truth that no court order could negate, they turned and walked away. The dust from the sheriff's car settled, leaving behind a profound silence. It wasn't the empty, lonely silence of before, but a quiet filled with the weight of what had just happened. Silas and Alara stood on the porch for a long time, the afternoon sun warming their faces. The threat had passed, the outside world had been turned away at their door. He finally looked down at her, and for the first time, he placed his hand gently on her shoulder. She didn't flinch. She leaned into the touch, a small, trusting gesture that spoke volumes. Inside, the house felt different. The air was lighter. That evening, Silas did something he hadn't done in a decade. He went into the closed-off room, the shrine to his son, and he opened the window. He let the fresh, pine-scented air chase away the stale scent of grief. He didn't pack the memories away. He simply let them breathe. The next day, he began to make changes. He fixed the broken step on the porch. He painted the kitchen a cheerful, buttery yellow. He bought a small, second-hand radio so the house could be filled with music instead of just the rumble of trains. He started talking about Maria and Daniel, not as ghosts of his failure, but as people he had loved. He told Alara about his son's laugh, about his wife's garden, and Alara listened, her presence a quiet affirmation that it was okay to remember, that memories were not dead weight after all. She, in turn, began to flourish. Her humming turned into singing. She learned the layout of the entire property, walking with a newfound confidence. She taught Silas how to truly listen, not just to the trains, but to the wind in the trees, to the rhythm of the crickets at night, to the subtle shifts in a person's breathing that said more than words ever could. One afternoon, he found her sitting on the porch, a piece of smoothed wood in her hands. He had given her a small carving knife and a block of pine. Her fingers, so sensitive and sure, were slowly shaping the wood. It was rough, uneven, but the shape was unmistakable. It was a bird, its head tilted as if in song. He sat beside her, watching her work. The railroad track still gleamed in the distance, a symbol not of escape, but of the world that passed them by. His world was no longer out there. It was right here, on this porch, with this girl. They were a strange and unlikely family, two solitary souls forged together by cruelty and saved by a simple act of kindness. The future was an unknown territory, a track stretching into the horizon. But for the first time in a very long time, Silas wasn't looking down the line. He was looking at the home he had finally built.